Hi, welcome to the Property Show. I'm Jayashree Kurup. I'm editor MBTV. We talk about the rental markets here, the rental real estate markets, residential, retail, commercial. There's a lot that we need to come to terms with in the Indian market. So how do we institutionalize the rental real estate in India? That's the topic of conversation. Joining me in this discussion is Kuldip Chawlla. He's the group CFO of Puravankara. Thanks, Kuldip, for joining us. There's Ashoo Gupta. She's partner, Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas. Thanks, Ashoo. Mudassir Zaidi is ED North of Knight Frank, India. Hi, Mudassir, welcome to the show. And Ankit Gupta, he's the CEO of Frontier Business, leading the Oyo Life business. Thanks, Ankit, for joining us. Let's talk about the trigger for this conversation. Somewhere, the rental housing was a very loosely held proposition, and there were many things that were right with it, that were wrong with it, but nobody really, it was not in the forefront. I think I'm going to first start with Ankit. Ankit, you are part of that brand of warriors who actually brought rental real estate into the limelight with aggregations. So how did this start, and what stage do you think we are at today?
So, Jayashree, my perspective in two pieces. Prior to, I was with a company called McKinsey, where I was a partner for leading all the real estate transformation work. And I come to specifically the aggregation co-living sector in a bit. Let me also talk about the broader real estate rental market. So India is one of those unique markets where there is a huge arbitrage in rental real estate compared to the sales side, where you have yields. Sorry, go ahead.
Your voice is breaking. Maybe one way out would be to put off the video, then your audio would be clearer.
Let me try that.
Yeah.
Is this better?
Yes, we can hear you. Go on.
Yeah. So I was saying that India is one of those peculiar markets where the arbitrage between buying a property versus renting a property is quite high. I mean, typically residential rental yields in the market are about 1.5 to 2.5%, versus if you buy a property, on a loan basis, 8 to 9% can be somewhere the cost that you land. In India, I think given the pandemic, we are in a peculiar situation. Everything has, in terms of the economy, come to a slowdown. The government is, by the way, doing a lot that it can to revive the economy, to take care of the pandemic situation, health, etc. In the short term, real estate, I do think, has taken a bit of a hit. And therefore, the sales side of real estate is going to take longer to come back, giving a fast track opportunity to rental real estate, in my view. We are seeing data where we are seeing that while sales have gone down, the rental real estate part of the world is actually picking up dramatically in India. And in that context, co-living is becoming a big opportunity. Till pre-COVID, we were seeing that there was a trend where people used to treat co-living as a stopgap solution for a few months. There was high attrition because people used to shift to rental housing in apartments or buy apartments outside. But now we're seeing a reverse trend where people, because of safety, are preferring co-living, for example, with shared flats. And the opportunity is such that on a yearly basis, if there are 55-60 lakh people migrating to the top 10 cities, the current organized co-living sector is only about 5% of that market. So even if overall demand moves up or down, the headroom for co-living as a real estate rental segment is huge.
Yeah. Ashoo, you can switch it on when you're not speaking. You can switch it on so we can see you on the screen as well, right? I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Ashoo, no, Ashoo, you can keep yours is okay. Ashoo, I'm going to talk about the legal aspect of it. Rental real estate, the government's own assessment was that about 1.1 crore housing was locked up across India, probably because rental laws were skewed. Either, it was the safety of the asset when you lease out your properties has been a problem, a historic problem here. Do you see any changes happening? Do you think that we have been able to settle those legal problems?
So to a certain extent, rent laws are each state specific. As far as Maharashtra is concerned, they have tried to address this issue through the Rent Control Act of 1999. They did set out some measures which ensured that if the tenant overstayed, he was required to pay double the rent and all of that, and they also tried to expedite by having a special competent authority that in case somebody overstays, they are able to get those people evicted, which was not the case earlier. Now the government is trying to introduce a Model Tenancy Act where they are trying to cover a few aspects. For example, if easy eviction, what are the rights that a tenant has in case they, what are the rights a landlord has in case they overstay. For example, they have suggested that if you overstay for more than 2 months, you'll have to pay double. And if you exceed that, then you have to pay 4 times. But this has to be adopted in each state, which we are still to, implement it, and it will see in other states also. There are issues where people are more concerned that their asset they may not get back because the tenant may just overstay in the asset, may not pay rent, may not get evicted because the tenant laws are very much in favor of the tenants instead of the landlord.
Now, Kuldip, we've seen a lot of people. Real estate was a good investment option for a lot of people. And if you look at the portfolio, a lot of middle-income people, professionals, had built up a portfolio of properties, probably because it would have yielded rental returns. There are two things that have happened. One is that the rental returns have actually not gone up; they have actually gone down. The purchased property the prices have been flat, but rental returns have come down. Has that impacted the number of investors coming into the market? Kuldip, you're on mute.
Am I audible now?
Yeah. Please.
All right, for sure, Jayashree, but I think we need to just step back and look at the return that investors or people who are buying residential property for rental were looking at. They were looking at 3 aspects. Number one, the laws which changed a couple of years ago, they would get tax breaks. I think those have been put under limits. So the net effective return goes down. That's point number one. Point number 2 is what you just said, which is that the rentals themselves have either stagnated or in many cases gone down. And number 3, equally important, is the fact that, the capital values have also stagnated or in some cases come down. So when investors who were looking at making returns from these were looking at 3 aspects to summarize. Number 1, they were talking of financial engineering to leverage, and now the benefit of interest tax deduction on the loans to buy such property is no longer available. Number 2, rents, and number 3, capital appreciation. But in the context of what we're talking about, I think the same principles will apply. Now, to be fair, depending on which segment we're talking about, there may be a cap, or certainly a cap on the increase in rentals, depending on which segment you're talking about. If you're talking of a specific segment, so if you're talking for migrant labor rentals, if you're talking of the social housing segment, then I think we will have to accept that. But the fact remains that for what is essentially a capital intensive sector, the upfront premium in one of the models and the upfront capital investment in land in the other model becomes a very important determinant of whether and to what extent returns are made, and therefore to what extent, really, if I may say so at the risk of being immodest, the success of what is essentially a very good watershed development, how that plays out.
Yeah, absolutely. Mudassir, about 3 years ago, we worked with KPMG. We took the Magic Bricks data, we worked with KPMG, and we tried to figure out whether residential real estate was actually a good investment option. One of the things that we studied was the return on your investment. Even while, when you take residential real estate, the investment and the returns are was about 1.5 to about 3%, but the leveraged returns were 7 to 8%. Unlike the commercial real estate, where your regular rental returns were about 7 to 8%, 6 to 8%, but your the returns, the leverage returns at the end of it was not more than about 2 to 3%. So net, it was about 10%. It's a question of what you wanted out of your investment. However, in real estate, there were different categories of housing and different types of housing. If you bought in the core city areas, you had to pay a little more, but the return that you got in the rent was higher. So your monthly rental returns were in well-established areas was higher, whereas you were in the peripheral areas, you were paying a little less because it's new properties, it's coming up. But the rental returns that you were getting was also lower because there was more stock and stuff like that. What are your findings in this rental, the spectrum of rental returns?
Yeah, so overall, as earlier alluded by Kuldip as well, I think the overall, since 2013, when the real estate market started really going into a bearish phase, and it is still in that, that longish bearish phase that we've been seeing, is almost about 7 years now. I used to, observe, markets like NCR had about 60% people actually buying to hold that, not for self-usage, but for trying to, to either eventually sell it further or hold it and get some kind of a rental return. Everybody wanted to have some kind of rental portfolio, as you yourself also mentioned. However, because that entire long established dynamics have changed now, where your capital value increases have stagnated so much or have gone down, that suddenly you find that hardly any investors exist anymore into the market. So obviously, nobody is really interested in eventually managing a rental portfolio. Everybody wanted to eventually build a capital value portfolio. The rental income was incidental to the entire thing, because getting an entire portfolio, managing it yourself, if you don't occupy it through tenants, etc., the chances of that capital value going down further was even higher. So it was best to get it occupied so that it gets maintained, etc. Plus the income on the rental side also keeps coming in, which is, as I said, incidental to the entire thing. Everybody was looking at capital value increases rather than making that 2-3% on the overall thing. In fact, it was quite ironical that the more in demand the property, the rental return was slightly lower. So the range is, as you said, 1.5 to 3%. A property which is far more in demand in city center and is highly valued would have a far lower 1.5% rental yield, versus if you get a 3% thing, which means eventually you're not making so much on the capital values per se. So those dynamics are now changing significantly at the moment. You're hardly finding investors who want to hold to really rent it out. It's largely end users who are coming into the market, which is now therefore bringing about a change in terms of thinking, and also the COVID crisis, and now with the new scheme that the government has come about. Certainly these long existing issues, because I think we were just a lot of stock was getting built, a lot of people were buying it, a lot of whoever was wanting to lease it out was able to do that. A lot of it was getting locked because of issues with trying to find the right kind of tenants and the safety of leasing it out. All these long-held, kind of systemic things that were just continuing to happen have all got broken, because the market has really suffered in terms of capital values. A lot of people think it's not really getting them enough money for the risk that they're taking. And therefore, government has now come into play to bring about certain changes in the system, in the laws and the regulations to bring about some level of comfort for landlords as well as for tenants. So the Model Tenancy Act that was talked about right now, that is certainly going to help in terms of bringing about some level of safety to that. Now with the the social housing, affordable rental housing complexes, etc., that the government is talking about, hopefully should bring about some level of activity there as well. So I think we are now at the cusp of a huge change in the way rental housing is going to be looked at. I think what has been up till now being looked at, where people invest for coming out with rental housing portfolio, etc. I think that will start diminishing unless we start seeing an increase in terms of rental yields. In the Western markets per se, where the cost of capital is 3-4%, your rental yields are 4-5% for decent things, versus, as mentioned earlier, your cost of capital is 9-10% in usual times. It's come down to 7-8% at the moment, but your rental yields are still in the 1.5 to 3% range. So unless that changes significantly, or there is huge government intervention to promote rental housing through taxation, benefits on taxation, benefits of viability gap fundings, etc., unlocking of a lot of real estate that the government has, which obviously they have proposed to do that. A huge amount of that initiative that comes in, I think that should bring about a change in terms of how rental housing will look at. We are at the cusp of that, but I think a lot more needs to be done in terms of how things will pan out.
Absolutely. Rental has actually come center stage. At least the narrative has come center stage. How it plays out in the market is definitely going to change. Ankit, when I had Anuj Puri coming to our show about a year ago and saying that what the change that people like you, the co-living space aggregators, what you did was you offered a ray of hope for a lot of investors, saying that you don't have to manage the physical asset yourself. There is an aggregator. You are dealing with a corporate entity, and therefore there was a certain level of trust that the individual investors had in dealing with a corporate entity. Has that changed? Has COVID changed that?
So yeah, it has changed that for the I think for the
Ankit, maybe you should put your video off.
If you realize
yeah,
is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, I was saying it has absolutely changed that for the positive, because if you realize, even earlier the biggest struggle individual investors or owners of properties had was around generating demand in their local micro market cluster, right?
Yeah.
And players like us have been able to capture that opportunity and help each of these individual players by bringing different kinds of channels of demand. I mean, one of the biggest channels, for example, we have is obviously our online demand portal through which we generate demand. But we have other channels which are, for example, corporate tie-ups and so on. In the current environment, that requirement of demand support has gone up even more. A few trends, for example, that we are seeing in the market is one, people are now starting to come back, which over the past 3 months, we had seen a little bit of a reverse migration happening from urban centers. Those people are coming back, and they are now searching for a lot more hygienic, sanitized, safe places to stay in, versus the typical unorganized, mom and pop stores, which were aplenty. And therefore, given that sweet spot of saying, yes, there is a player generating demand, there is a quality control given whenever we tie up with a certain individual property owner, we make sure that they run it according to a certain safety standard and hygiene standard of our SOPs, while providing a slightly lower than rental in that micro market. So providing a good quality stay at a great price is what our offering is. And that dependency, I think, is making the market even stronger today.
Did the returns, the rental returns of 1.5 to 3%, did that change? Because Anuj had suggested that aggregators are actually helping people get better returns of about 4.5% as well.
So if you look at a long-term view of the market, actually this market is providing that opportunity. Because what is happening is that the per square foot return in a co-living play ends up being much higher as compared to what you would do in a classic rental requirement. And as per my earlier point, that 1.5 to 2%, the arbitrage play is absolutely there. But the moment you have a 30, 40, 50 bed property where you have, say, a 60, 70% occupancy, that generates a per square foot return which enables the rental yields to go up to, we've seen in certain micro markets as high up as 4.5, 5%.
Jayashree, I'd like to make a point here, if I may.
Yeah, please.
I think what Ankit is saying is very instructive, because from a developer's end, and I've had the privilege of being an investor as well in my past life for many years. I think what he's saying is very interesting, because there are a couple of things, and I'd also like to pick up on what Mudassir said and make 2 points. Point number one, just going back to Ankit's point, is that, when you do aggregation in any way, shape or form, right? Apart from the value added services, so on and so forth, which depending on which segment you're playing on, you can, gain from or not, there are economies of scale. Okay. I think the government's also giving additional FAR, so on and so forth, and there could be other things around it. That's part one. Part two is we could seriously think about how do you equate the difference between EMIs or rents paid and house rent allowance, So I think if there are some benefits, and I think, those guidelines have some interesting things there, I think we need some more work to be done there. The third aspect, which is important, is, this is a capital intensive sector. Okay, number three. So to the extent that I can get long-term capital at a cheaper rate, because I am doing something on the sustainability side, reducing carbon emissions, so on and so forth, particularly on the lower end of this rental spectrum, I think there is a play there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And number four is we have to look at the fact that there is a environmental and social and sustainability benefit, because we're reducing the carbon footprint. And this can be fairly substantial if you look at 2 decades, 3 decades, those kind of periods. A, B, you look at India, C, you're looking at urban India. So I think there is a case to be made there, on all these 3 or 4 points. Just wanted to make that.
Absolutely. In fact, Kuldip, I'll remain with you. I wanted to ask you, we've seen the flight of the investors, right? In the last 2-3 years, it's almost as though being an investor was a bad thing. But for the real estate market, being an investor, having investors in the market was a good thing. It was just that the market was not mature enough to understand that if an investor comes in and he puts his money in, there has to be an exit policy also, which means there had to be a predictability in the market, which somewhere got broken. In the current scenario, a post-RERA regime where policy is more or less streamlining this entire business, do you see that investor coming back? And if so, what is that profile of the investor?
So let me just step back, and I'm presuming we're talking this only in the context of predictable rental returns.
Absolutely.
Right? So I think we need to appreciate that, investors seek risk-adjusted returns.
Yeah.
Okay. Particularly what we've seen in the last 7 to 10 years in India, first they were moving towards the office and IT segment,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Then more recently, they've moved into data centers and warehousing and logistics, right? There is the odd instance of, and very interesting business models of, both student housing, as well as the education REITs. And I'm sure you'll see a couple of those come forward. The point I'm trying to make is that if we have predictive, non-policy driven, stable returns, I think there is a market. Now, obviously, that underscores the fact that, to the point that Ankit made, it needs to move from the 2-3% range to the 5 to 7% range, for it to make interest. Because at the end of the day, India is a capital starved economy. So unless you can get a large amount of the social savings into this market, okay, which is one option, okay, including the pension funds operating in India, raising money from India, a large part of the money needs to come from overseas. right? That capital needs to factor in, apart from emerging market / India risk. That's why I said there needs to be no policy risk. There needs to be predictability, right? And also, we mustn't forget, although, the rupee dollar of late has been okay, but, it's seen wild swings.
Yeah.
So I think that's the other thing that you need to factor in about foreign capital. But that said, I think this is, a great opportunity, from life to livelihood to now we're talking about livability. And if you look at the fact that there are some 22 million urban households on rent in India, and there are some 7 or 8 states which make up 70–80% of that, right? And if you look at, and there's enough data to show that 20% of people are living on rent, right? And at the same time, if you look at what's happened to migration, and I'll just make the point that if you look at the Deccan Triangle, which is Hyderabad, Bangalore, and Chennai, and you look at the data there, you will see that between 40 to 50% of the people are on rent. And the population, due to migration in these cities across all segments, from low to high to mid to high, that has increased dramatically. So the short point I'm trying to make is that India has a large population, right? I think the window of opportunity is large. COVID has given us an opportunity that we should not waste.
Yeah.
Between the JNURM from 2005, to the policy in 2015 to today, we've lost between 5 and 15 years, right? I think it behoves us as a nation, to take advantage of this, because like Ankit said, people are coming back. They want cleaner facilities. See, needs and wants, let's leave the wants aside. Let's say the needs, are growing, right? The resources are limited. But I think this policy gives us the framework within which to attract private investment, possibly in a private-public format, but definitely it does give us that opportunity.
Ashoo, let's take it one step further from there. Name any 4 or 5 laws that you think need to be tweaked so that this rental market, what Kuldip and Ankit have been talking about, needs to move in a streamlined fashion. You did mention that it's a state subject, but look at the market as it exists today, the legal framework, and tell us what needs to be tweaked so that this can become a structured market.
So the main and the most important thing is the rental laws to be able to attract investors. I still believe that the rental laws have to be made equally relevant for the investor as well as for the tenant. Just now they are very, very pro-tenant. Then second is development control regulations. The development, there's only as much space as is available. So the development control regulation should permit higher FSI and higher density so that the developer is able to invest and get his returns. The third thing is that our approval process is very, very lengthy, from buying the land to getting the conversion to getting approvals, and all the investors' money is just stagnating and he's not getting anything out of it. So there has to be a single window clearance that needs to be done. The fourth thing is that the government itself has a lot of land which is untapped, and in fact is not even able to, take care of it.
Ashoo, I think you have a technical problem. We can't hear you. If you could put off the video, your audio will be available to us.
Basis so that the cost is very low to the investor.
Sorry, we didn't hear what you said. Your video froze. So if you could just repeat the last bit of it.
The government has a lot of land bank. If they could release that land bank, they need not necessarily sell it, but they can give it at a very reasonable low rent so that the developer has the land. There are a lot of title issues, in which when a developer goes, he struggles. So this would also substantially help. He has a lease, it's a government land, he doesn't require to do any diligence. And, the development with a 30-day deeming provision be there, that they submit the approvals. If the government doesn't respond, they can go ahead, they can, start development, and also all these things will really help the developer to have incentive to invest in this. And also the laws need to ensure that he's required to pay property tax, all of those things, that the rental income is enough so that he's able to at least get a decent return instead of just 1.3 to, between 1.3 to 3%. If he could get a higher return, then there is some incentive for him to come. Otherwise, and there is also a lot of fear that whether this market will stay, not stay. So it is better that he's taken higher income, higher loans. His interest rates are about 7 to 8% compared to the income that he's generating. So one has to not only look at the tenants, but also has to look at what the investor or the developer requirements are fulfilled, so that, we can do this well. And most importantly, I think that we don't have the expertise right now. So the government should form a body of, a developer, an architect, a lawyer, a financial advisor, and as well as, we go to other countries like Singapore and all, where they have really done the social housing and other things very well. So we get their expertise instead of just, jumping into it. We do a feasibility study. We understand how things have to be taken forward, so that midway we are not just stuck.
Absolutely. I'm going to pick up 2-3 things that Ashoo said, and Mudassir, I'm going to come to you. One is, we did talk about the predictability of this market. Now, with laws swinging wildly state to state, what happens is that predictability of that rental return is compromised. The second thing is, while like she said, that the governments should ensure that the builders can work well. There is another aspect that is not covered. The EDC, IDC is taken, the external development charges are all paid, but the external development does not happen, and there is no accountability at the municipal level. You can have rows and rows of very, very plush housing, but you will find that if you step out into nothingness. The roads are not made and things like that. And these are things that impact, especially on rental markets. These have a significant impact. What is it that should be done? Because rental housing is in conversation today, I thought it's good to address these issues as well.
Jayashree, absolutely right. You talked about ADC, IDC. Largely, we're talking about infrastructure development as something which is a huge driver for real estate. From a perspective of people buying, as well as from a perspective of people actually renting it out and actually utilizing it. I think the government obviously plays a major role in developing the infrastructure. I think they have been very, very well intentioned in the last 5, 7, 10 years. We've seen a lot of focus on infra being built. However, I think we are getting affected by the overall issues with the current laws that we have. Ashoo pointed out about the entire the entire real estate and land related thing being state issues. So even though the central government is really well intentioned, has brought about a lot of changes, be it RERA, be it MTA, which is the Model Tenancy Act, be it the current other focus on rental housing, etc. I think everything has to be adopted by all the states. Some of them are pro-center, some of them are not so pro-center, etc. There's a huge issue with, and it's not about political affiliations, but whoever is in the center, whoever is on the opposite side will not really support. So there is a huge well-intentioned push towards it, but it has not happened for various reasons. The current laws, the issues with the pace of judiciary, the issues with current laws of acquisition per se, how acquisition gets done, etc. It's a very, very slow, archaic process which gets stopped at various points. So from acquisition to everybody wanting to go to the courts to stop it, and then it taking its own sweet time. There have been so many infrastructure projects which have got stuck over a period of time. For example, NCR, the Dwarka Expressway has been in the making for, umpteen number of years. People have buildings have come up. There's no way to reach there, or even if there is a way to reach there, it's all, not even to the level that they had thought about. There was all small or even rural roads that reach you to these high, nice, plush complexes, but hardly any way to reach them per se. So huge issues with infrastructure which are there. There have been some cities within the country which have done very, very well out there. In fact, there are some cities, for example, Hyderabad is a shining example where they were able to build very, very good, decent infrastructure, and therefore, the housing per se has. So there are two sides to the coin as well. So with large, good infrastructure coming in, housing can come further away from city centers as well, and people can travel from there to wherever their place of work is, and which gives a lot of rightly priced opportunity for people to buy and hold assets. But that also lends to the capital values not going up so fast, because if infrastructure doesn't happen, then there are various islands that get kind of come about in each city, which are very, very much in demand. People don't want to live far away because it's difficult to get to their place of work or wherever else. But if you do build that infrastructure that helps people getting, stay further away, keeps the overall social, objective of housing intact per se, where it is accessible to a lot more people, from a capital value perspective as well as from a rental value perspective as well, which can also improve the overall rental yields on those, because if capital values don't go up so significantly, your rental yields will continue to be slightly better off compared to very high price city center properties per se. So infrastructure will certainly play a huge role, and therefore it keeps coming back to what the government can do. In terms of incentivizing the entire thing. Infrastructure is one of them. Regulations is the second. And all of this is we're moving towards it. But since these are all legacy issues affecting the industry for such a long time, it will take time for it to come about. But like I mentioned earlier as well, we are at the cusp of a huge paradigm shift in terms of how things are going to come about. With the economy also, not growing as fast as it was earlier. I think expectation in terms of capital values per se also will not be disproportionate as they were earlier. In some of the very hot markets, people were expecting 15, 20, 25% returns every year, doubling of property prices every 3 years. So rentals didn't really care about that by too much. But now with all that stabilizing, and hopefully in times to come will continue to be a more normal kind of a growth trajectory, I think rentals will come into being far more important in terms of that as a portfolio, as a way of earning, etc. And institutionalization, which is what you want to be talking about. I think that will lead towards that, because up till now it was just too hot, it was just too unpredictable, it was just too I would say a bubble in the making per se. And institutions don't like that unless there is predictability, there is stabilization per se. But if you see that already happening on the commercial side, where already a lot of the funds are now the biggest in terms of landlords. The developers are not anymore the biggest landlords. All the funds, be it regular funds, be it pension funds per se, are the biggest landlords. I think slowly and steadily that should come about on the residential side as well, which will push the the rental housing on a far more positive side, I would say.
In fact, I take that to Kuldip. In fact, Kuldip, I think when we're talking about an institutionalized funding for the rental housing markets, that's an area of expertise for you. Do you see that happening, and what does it take to bring institutional money into formal rental housing?
So I think, let me put it this way: the die has been cast, right? As they say, the proof of the pudding is in the implementation. So we have to roll up our sleeves and get, and demonstrate, in a manner of speaking, the efficacy of the model.
Yeah.
Now in this context, I just want to pick up two points that have been made a couple of minutes ago. Number one, always talks about, capital approvals, infrastructure.
Mhm.
My point is this. I'll give you 4 examples in 4 different cities. I think they're in the heart of the city. There is government land. It is lying idle. It's lying idle for decades. I think all that it requires is 2 things: approvals and a technology-led speedy implementation schedule. The latter is available in this country. We ourselves are doing it precast. There's no rocket science. There are lessons like Ashoo said from Singapore elsewhere. So that is part one. Part two is that as far as approvals are concerned, my limited point is that we should have public agencies or government do things which are discreet and do not involve continuous engagement with the government. So if it's a one-time approval, and I said I'll give you 4 examples. There is IDP in Gurgaon, heart of the city, MTNL, Air India, many others. Hindustan Antibiotics has some 60 plus acres in Pune. You have HMT Bearings, some 15 acres in Hyderabad. Okay, you've got a small town, like not small anymore, Ranchi. HEC has 60 acres in Ranchi. So what I'm trying to say is there are enough such examples around the country, because the reason I'm saying that is because we did some math and we figured that if we have to make an investment and hold it for 25 years, for it to make sense, land cost needs to be below 5 crores an acre. Land cost below 5 crores an acre, Mudassir is right, will not be in areas where infrastructure is developed. So therefore, you need to do one of 2 things. Either you need to have greater incentives, increase the period, or we need to have some technology-led solutions, so on and so forth. Okay. Coming back to the point of institutional capital, I think just like, I remember Niranjan Hiranandani saying this on a seminar a few years ago. He said, if the first 1 or 2 REITs are good models and are successful, you will see a flood of money. Today, I think we are at that cusp, COVID notwithstanding. That said, my limited point is if we can demonstrate through a couple of examples the efficacy of both an asset light model as well as a partnership model in which the government's or the public agencies' involvement is limited, I think there is a long window of opportunity, because institutional capital is happier getting a predictable level of relatively lower returns for a longer period of time than they are, unpredictable high rates of return. Because at the end of the day, institutional capital is not an operator manager model. Although in this kind of format, you can see that as well, as we have seen in the case of warehousing and other segments. So I think it's important that we get, the nuances sorted out. The first 1 or 2 or 3 models off the ground quickly. You can deliver these kind of homes in 12 to 15 months from breaking ground. It has been done in India with regular housing. This is a cookie cutter approach, because these are not going to be, this is stuff that is not going to be 50 stories high, 40 stories high. Unlikely,
Yeah. Ankit, let's take it to you from there. Do you get enough institutional funding for institutional rental housing? And what needs to change so that this becomes attractive to capital?
Jayashree and everybody, I want to share one perspective, given all that I've heard. In this entire discussion, we have discussed landowners, we have discussed funding and investors, we have discussed the government. I actually want to provocatively discuss consumers, tenants, the guys who are actually going to use this real estate.
Yeah.
for the longest time, unfortunately, in India, real estate has been a sector which has been looked upon as a supply play because of the kind of returns it has got. People have said, let me invest in real estate, wo to badh hi jayega over time, and then I'll either flip, I'll have a long-term play, etc., and I'll get capital gains. I think there is a paradigm shift needed in India where real estate is started to get seen as a consumer-centric play, right? Like typical consumer companies. And I think that is where the opportunity is immense, even in terms of funding, in terms of returns, and so on. Now, for example, again, sharing some trends we are seeing in the co-living, and I'm 100% sure that will be applicable to the other normal rental segment as well. We are seeing in the current context, like I said, 50% of the people who now are coming and staying with us are people who are migrating back from smaller towns to cities. 50% of the others are actually migrating from unorganized segment place to us with 2 or 3 requirements. Number one, clean, hygienic, safety as the premium requirement that they want. The second is, in that context, given a low touch requirement of safety, amenities like utensils, amenities like the refrigeration, the common area, etc., being minimally used so that there is minimal exposure. The third one is basic things like Wi-Fi, given that the current environment is a mix of work from home and work from office model. This whole play about whether work from home is going to become the norm of how people operate going forward, we are at least not seeing that. In the current environment, we are clearly seeing that it's a hybrid. People are staying in co-living place, and they're seeing that we, in a week, maybe go for 3 or 4 days to the office, but while in the remaining time, they work from home. So having the facility so that you are able to work comfortably from your co-living place is a very, very big requirement. Those facilities are, for example, what we are focusing on. And I'm sure many others would be as well. The reason I'm bringing this out is because in the end, if we bring consumer centricity to the forefront, automatically demand gets created, because in the end, demand is where anything and everything makes or breaks whether a sector flourishes or does not. Technology, for that matter, right? We are now investing in technology across the ecosystem, where while we have an app for our customers, whether when they are choosing where they want to stay, as well as when they are staying in house, in terms of various requirements, in terms of interacting with us, we have now extended that technology even to our landlords who operate the properties, to be able to engage with the customers, to be able to engage with us, to raise any requests and so on. And we have the same extension now to our employees, because we see a huge upside in terms of operating leverage through this, as well as capturing data analytics to be able to serve our customers better. So I think that paradigm shift is where the opportunity lies, according to me.
Okay. Will that also translate into more being able to secure more formal finance?
Needless to say, if demand goes up, automatically you see a higher return, and therefore the confidence from institutional or other funding, even individual funding, goes up, because then your rental yields start making sense. A property, let's say, which is a 50-60 bed property, at a 30% occupancy versus, because it is run well and is consumer centric, is running at 80% occupancy, has a much higher yield in this property versus the other, right? And therefore the confidence in institutional funds to say, yes, let us kind of invest behind this play is much higher.
Mudassir, we've seen
Jayashree, I just want to make a point, because I think it's also just important for us to step back and see what Ankit is talking about is one segment of the market. And I think he made a very interesting point, and I want to endorse that with 2 comments. Comment number 1 is, yes, we should look at the customer. The question is, who's the customer? Ankit's customer, with due respect, is a little different. What I'm trying to say is in the rental housing market, there are 3 or 4 different types of customers, right? One is a need-based kind of a customer. You know, you have teachers, you have migrants, you have students, so on and so forth. Okay. The second is the EWS social housing. That's a different requirement, right? And the third is, you know, public, which is owned by government. So there are different market-driven customers. The requirements of each are different. I think, you know, whilst we may not have time to address it in this seminar or webinar, I just want to make that point that I think it's important for us to realize, and we do need to address their requirements, because whilst we've talked of all the other things, we haven't talked. And Ankit, you know, I tip my hat to you, because I think the customer has remained out of this thing. Till now, it was a supply-driven thing. Thank God it's become now a demand-driven economy, at least on the real estate side.
Mudassir, we've seen the maximum amount of commercial take-up of space in 2019. It's a landmark that is unparalleled even across the world. But when that translates into commercial space, what does it do to the residential markets in terms of rental markets? Because a lot of this workforce are migrant workforce. They come from city A to city B, work there, they live on rent there. And what does this do to the market? How does that change?
See, generally, the thumb rule is that with commercial space being taken up, which will translate into more jobs, and therefore, you know, the thumb rule is for most organization, you know, about 100 square feet per person. So you can easily look at, you know, trying to understand what kind of, you know, job addition any space take up will do. You know, the average, even if you go down by a little bit, if there are, you know, different kinds of industries who look at a lower, you know, number, slightly higher density, etc. Even if you look at an average of about 75, 80 square feet per person in an organization, you can translate that into, as I said, the number of jobs that are getting added to the
now
overall.
if we have a smaller space, especially for the next 2 years, because of the COVID-driven paranoia, I don't think we'll come down to 70, 80 square feet. We may actually pick it up at higher than 100, right?
So there are various views to that. I don't think people have really come to a solution yet, or rather, it's not become a one-stop solution yet in terms of whether lower density is the answer to that. So, like Ankit alluded to the earlier point, where some people are being called for a few days only in the you know, in the week. So not everybody is there 5 or 6 days a week. So by rotation, people are being brought to office. So that's one solution. The other is, as you said, lower density, and therefore a lower number of people in a larger space per se. Thirdly, people are talking about work from home itself. There are some companies which are you know, allowing work from home till some of them have allowed till December. Some of them are allowed till next year as well, in 2021. So there will be various mechanisms that companies will adopt to understand what best works for them. So there will be a hybrid model. Some will have partial work from home. Some will have, you know, full-time work from home. Some will have everybody coming to office. For example, my organization has asked everybody to come back to office. You know, NCR, where I sit, we have to be back to 100%. Obviously, we are allowing people to you know, we are allowing exemptions per se. People can't travel due to public transport or have other issues with comorbidities, etc. But from a policy perspective, we've come back to 100%, where we're expecting everybody to come back, or rather, we are encouraging. Let me put it, not saying expecting, but encouraging people to come back to office. So there will be all kinds of things that will happen. So thumb rules will still remain there. It will take some time before the newer paradigm will kind of set itself, and we will know what would be the new thumb rules per se, but the understanding is very clear that with space getting taken up, more people will get jobs, and that will translate into some kind of a positive effect on housing. Now, many a times, again, depends on city to city, the type of industry that really in existence in those cities. So some of the you know, ITES driven markets like the south of India per se will have younger population, you know, kind of joining in there a lot more than more senior guys, etc., who will initially look at, taking up rental housing. And then once they feel confident about their job, or once they themselves start feeling where they want to be, and with the millennials now, and plus now, even after the millennials, now people are not anymore rooted to cities per se. In fact, they themselves will look at trying to analyze, understand what they want to do over a period of time before really rooting themselves. So obviously, with Indian culture, Indian mentality, you were not fully taken away from buying a home and settling down, especially after they have a family, get married, have a family, etc. They do want to get settled down somewhere once, especially they have children, they go start going to schools, etc. So till maybe about 5-10 years of their initial early working lives, they'll be far more mobile. They'll be more they'll take up co-living, they'll take up rental housing per se, and then that mentality, Indian mentality of owning an asset takes over eventually, and they will come back into buying something wherever it is, be it in the place that they stay, be it back home, as you mentioned earlier, wherever their hometown is, or wherever they feel that there is, there are better returns per se. But that will translate to positively to the housing market. Initially, as I would say, and because a lot more people are less rooted to their jobs, less rooted to any particular city, etc. The demand for rental housing, be it co-living, be it regular classic rentals per se, will going forward be much higher, and especially in those cities which have companies which employ much younger people, etc. That'll be much higher, and then eventually translate into purchase of housing per se, because that's where how largely the Indian mentality works per se. So it will have a direct effect. However, now going forward, that is also coming into a cloud because of the work from home kind of a thing. However, that has a more direct impact with the growth of the economy rather than with the overall space take up. So if the economy starts growing, business keeps growing for people, jobs will continue to be there, which will have a positive impact on both rental as well as for purchase of housing.
Sure. I'm going to take some of the queries that have come while we were discussing. There have been some queries that have come. Ashoo, I'm going to give you the first query. Why does the Tenancy Act also cover co-living, co-working companies as well? How do these new formats fit into the existing legal framework?
The present Tenancy Act as such does not cover it specifically, but since it is a very prevalent practice, this is in the informal market, what people are doing is they are entering into leave and license agreements, wherein all the 3 or 4 whatever people are executing the agreement and registering it. There are also separate agreements with respect to co-working, wherein it's called a working agreement itself, and the rules and regulations and all have been set out. The Model Tenancy Act has made a provision for co-living reference to a co-living agreement, but it is very much prevalent, and it is going on by way of leave and license agreements presently.
Do you think the government will offer any tax benefits or relax land laws to promote rental housing scheme and business related to it? Kuldip, would you like to take that? Do you think the government tax breaks are required?
Well, of course. I think the point is maybe the tax breaks are required for a shorter period of time, or to incentivize certain types of investments. So, for example, to encourage, and that you could link them to environmental and social benefits as well. But purely from a financial perspective, yes, any investor would like it to get to that threshold level. The point I'm trying to make is those cannot become the only basis for an investment. So I think we need to look at it a little bit more holistically, is my point.
Yeah, sure. There's a query, Mudassir, maybe you can take this. What opportunities will rental housing offer to developers in India? Even at the base of the pyramid, it was a build, own, operate for a period of time, and the land comes back to you after that period, and huge tax breaks and so on. Do you see this moving up the ladder, not only at the base of the pyramid, but even in other rental housing?
I think it's already starting to happen. A lot of developers are finding it tough to sell in today's market. Not just today's market, but the last many years.
Yeah.
A lot of them have inventory which is now nearing completion because of RERA. So earlier on, they could delay as much as possible, if required to, because there weren't any buyers per se. But now with RERA, they're completion requirements are there, and they have to, kind of do it within a time frame. Otherwise, there are penalties and other issues attached. So developers, a lot of the developers are beginning to not just construct, but complete and keep it ready. And many a times, if they've not been able to sell it, those remain empty, which further augments the problem that they have. Once it's ready and it's not maintained, then it goes into disrepair, and then it can further lend itself to not being sold, etc., because things become an issue out there. So so what we've seen happen in the last at least year and a half is that a lot of developers, and especially a lot of the co-living players, are actually looking to tie up with developers to take these spaces, sometimes entire block in the overall complex, or maybe sometimes different apartments that they can aggregate per se, and make that available as co-living places for various segments, be it students, be it early people who are early in their jobs, etc. So developers have begun to do that. Obviously for them, it's a situation where there's a lesser of the evil. Obviously, it's a residential is a self-liquidating model. Unless they sell, they will not be able to recover their money. They will not be able to pay their loans. They will not be able to make profits per se. So rental is not part of the model, but it is a lesser of the evil for them currently to tide over the issues that they are currently facing. So it's more of a stopgap arrangement, but they're willing to get into slightly longer-term contracts with co-living players to give those inventories that is lying ready but empty and might not be, and they will possibly incur further charges in terms of maintenance, etc. So this is more of a stopgap arrangement. Hopefully, when the markets start coming back, they will try to kind of sell that as pre-leased as well. That is also a possibility, because as mentioned earlier as well, that the rental return possibilities there are much higher than the general classic leasing of 1 to 2%. People are able to get 4-5%, maybe sometimes even higher than that if managed very well. So developers are looking at this as a stopgap, short-term opportunity, short to medium-term opportunity till the market start coming back. But later on, I would say, as things move and more people are willing to take up co-living type of opportunities or take up rental opportunities directly with that. We've seen some developers look at leasing that out directly as well, not just through co-living operators, but through directly leasing it out to people. So many of them have tried some kind of a hire purchase arrangement as well, where they're encouraging people to kind of come in, rent it out with the expectation that they will like and continue to be there and eventually buy there as well. And we've seen that happen very frequently, that once people start living in a certain location, in a certain complex, in a certain area, they would generally end up buying in that same place rather than shifting to absolutely another location, unless they're not happy out there. So with that, they're wanting people to come in, lease it out, and eventually buy it also. So those kind of opportunities developers are looking at, but eventually they, with rental housing per se, there have been a lot of developers who started looking at this. But my sense is, just like a different breed of developers came about in affordable housing development, the same guys, very few of them, maybe Puravankara has done that with Kuldip there, has come up with a different brand for affordable housing as well. But many of the developers have not got into affordable because it requires a very different way of thinking, very different way of doing things, which many of them have not come about, or they don't find it good, interesting enough to get into. And a different breed of developers have come about who have taken up the overall opportunity on affordable housing. So maybe that will happen on rental housing per se, where a different developers with different mindset who are willing to take it up per se to build rental housing for not just for selling but actually renting it out as being the objective will start coming about. And we've said this multiple times. We are at the start of that movement. I think consumer mentality is changing. Consumer is willing to look at rental housing in a different perspective rather than as a stopgap arrangement till they buy something. but many of them, especially millennials, look at it as a financial thing. They're less rooted to a city, they're less rooted to a place, less rooted to any particular property, and they look at it as a financial investment where instead of incurring 9-10% on cost on cost of capital for purchasing and not getting enough capital increases eventually, rather than doing that, invest into a 1.5-2% kind of a thing and use that money to invest somewhere else, maybe in an equity market or somewhere else, and then eventually maybe in times to come buy something when that portfolio grows through a financial instrument per se. So I'm sure different thoughts are coming about, but we are moving towards that market getting developed, and eventually developers also building for renting it out.
Our last 3 questions of the day, Kuldip, do you think that a developer like you, which has also gone into affordable segments, will also at some point pick up institutional rental housing and build for that?
We're, at the end of the day, the success of our business is in how efficiently we allocate capital. So I think, so long as, we're not biting off more than we can chew, we would, and potentially there is scope to not just, build homes, but also build the brand and the business, and, be a genuinely customer-centric business. We would like to look at that, provided the returns are more predictable and there.
Yeah, absolutely. Ankit, what are the costs of management and maintenance of rental properties, and do you think that more aggregation is required to get better economies of scale? Ankit?
So the cost of management are the elements around housekeeping, the elements around.
Ankit, maybe you need to put off the video.
The elements around we do that, and this Jayashree varies. If you look at this, if you look at the unit economics,
yeah, this
can vary anywhere between 20 to 40% of the total rent that someone pays. I think, to put things just in context, currently we are actually seeing these costs from our side to be higher, because we are taking a conscious call to invest a lot more in the safety and hygiene requirements of the customers, and therefore make sure that to make margins, we don't cut corners there. So again, in the spirit of consumer centricity, we are taking a call. It's fine to be lower and thinner on margins, but let's make sure that our customers are happy and satisfied. Needless to say, aggregation provides a huge, again, opportunity for us in terms of procurement, in terms of standardization, and so on, for getting the typical 15-20% out of the way, as opportunity and as leverage that many other companies do.
Ashoo, the last question of the day. Do you think that the legal system is ready to take on this affordable rental housing scheme, as well as co-living, where, there is the aggregators have, there is a certain formality around this agreement, but the market has not been used to this formality of management. Do you think the laws are strong enough?
So the government has introduced certain changes. Over a period of time, they will require to revamp it and all, but at least the thinking is that we move towards it, and they are taking all initiatives to do it. There is a rent authority they have set up. The government is taking all steps that is necessary to encourage, to be fair to both the parties, so that this moves ahead. So they are doing it. But they will need to, over a period of time, we will all evolve, and the laws may require to be suitably modified.
I think there's a lot of excitement in this market around rental housing. The finance needs to be in place. The legal system needs to be in place. There needs to be more accountability by a lot of government authorities and others. But overall, we seem to be moving, everyone seems to be pulling in the same direction. And that's the good news today. So thank you so much for joining us. This conversation has only just begun. The rental conversation has miles to go. But I feel that today was a good time to start this conversation. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.